Today, can China afford to be a global superpower? Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to this post covering finance and property news and a bit of philosophy and other things on the side. Today I'm joined by China expert Salvatore Babones. Hello there.
Hi, Martin. And let me just answer the question, no. And we can move on from there.
I thought you might say that. But surely with low interest rates and, applying MMT type philosophy, they can lend themselves unlimited amounts of money and just grow their deficit.
Well, I'm not a monetary economist, and I'll leave the economics to you. You're the expert. But the problem is that no matter how much money you have, you still have the same resources. And the resources just aren't there in China. But I will start with the money. The first problem China does have is a massive government budget deficit. So we're used to, being worried about a deficit here in Australia. Well, China has an official government budget, central government budget deficit of 5.5% of GDP. That was in 2019. All this is before coronavirus. Now, the IMF estimates that their true consolidated budget deficit of all governments was more like 12.5% of GDP. Now, I can't tell you how modern monetary theory applies to that in a country that has a non-market exchange rate with a highly managed currency with capital controls in place. I'm not the economist. I'm just going to point out that this wasn't so much a problem when China was growing at 8% per year, because even though China has for a long time run a government budget deficit, every year's income was more than the previous year's expenses. So in a sense, it was outgrowing its budget deficit. Okay, there was a deficit in some nominal sense, but the next year that deficit was made up. China's revenue growth, central government and all government revenue growth, pretty much stopped around 2017. It's been flat since. It's been growing slightly, but it hasn't been growing as quickly as expenses. Now, that's because growth has stalled. Growth in China, we all know the headline numbers have been 6.5%, forever. The better estimates that come out of using instrumental variable models, those are models that use variables like nighttime lights, like observations of cars in parking lots, of things like number of passengers on rail systems, these sorts of indirect measures. The instrumental variable models put those numbers at around 3 to 3.5%. So shave 3.3% off China's reported GDP statistics right there. Now that 3.3 or 3.5% growth, and again, I'm talking 2017, 2018, 2019, that is not growth as we would expect it in a market economy, or as we would experience it in a market economy. For example, in China, there's excess steel production estimated by the Chinese government, not estimated by outside economists, at 100 million tons a year. Now, 100 million tons a year is slightly more than the entire steel consumption of the United States. So China is producing this enormous amount of extra steel. Instead of the 900 million tons they need, they're producing 1 billion tons a year, and it's just getting stockpiled and rusted. Now, that's still economic output. It's not useful economic output, but when you're calculating GDP, that sure does go into GDP. And this is part of the problem with China's economic statistics. Not only are they inflated, but even when you deflate them, they include many activities that are simply not productive. And they're doing more and more of that as time goes on. That's why the return on capital in China has been falling like a rock for the last decade. Because China, instead of investing in activities that are going to produce future returns, are simply investing in order to keep people employed. It's investment as stimulus. As Japan demonstrated in the 1990s, investment as stimulus can only get you so far. It can't last forever.
Right. And that's, of course, the story of building roads to nowhere and building thousands and thousands and thousands of high-rises that are still vacant years after they've been built.
Right.
And as we discussed in one of our recent shows, GDP is just activity never mind whether it's productive activity in the real sense or not. So there are some real, not theoretical, real limits then on China's ability to be able to actually continue to expand.
Right. There are real limits, and we're starting to see the effects of that. So, for example, we always hear this figure, China's $1 trillion Belton Road initiative. Well, that $1 trillion of announcements is recycled over and over again. We hear projects being re-announced. The most famous one is a highway in Serbia that every year at the China-Serbia Economic Forum, they get together and they announce this multi-million-dollar highway project in Serbia. And they've been announcing it every year for the last 5 years. It never actually gets built. We see that on a much bigger scale with the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Again, if you look at these maps of Belton Road, there's a big line going from China across the Himalayas down into Pakistan. In fact, they did finish the Karakoram highway over the mountain passes. And then immediately after they finished it, there was a landslide. And it was closed for another 7 months while they had to dig it back out again. And that's the problem, of course. You can put it on a map. You can go build a highway that then gets landslided again, then build it again, then it gets covered again. But it doesn't mean any trucks are ever going to deliver goods across this high mountain pass. There's certainly never going to be deliveries of oil. And again, we see these maps that say China can avoid the Straits of Malacca and the Malacca choke point. That's the straits between Singapore and Sumatra, by redirecting oil via Gwadar port in Pakistan, and then pipelining it or trucking it up into Western China and then back across Chinese pipelines to Eastern China. None of that is possible in actual real world terms. The high altitude pipelines would require so much pumping that it would not be worth actually pumping the oil over them. Because remember, you've got to pump oil over a 16,000 foot pass. Well, someone's got to get that oil, up there to do it. And of course, the cold in the winter, the avalanches that occur, not to mention the terrorist attacks, because of course all of this is in separatist regions of Western Pakistan. So, all of these projects, whether it's Eastern Europe, it's Pakistan, where there's supposed to be a high-speed rail link. Your viewers may remember that several years ago, actually I think now it's 6 years ago, China announced high-speed rail to Singapore. There was going to be a high-speed rail connecting Yunnan province in southern China. Kunming Station was going to be the hub. And you can see it on these Belton Road maps, this high-speed rail system to Singapore. Where is it? Well, nowhere, right? It's not built at all. The transit routes to Myanmar have never materialized. So all over the world, Belt and Road projects are repeatedly announced, but they don't happen. And a lot of the reason they don't happen is that countries don't want to spend the money themselves. They're waiting for China to spend the money. And China is increasingly saying that they want to see other countries put up a portion of the cash. It's kind of ironic that people in Australia are really worried about China's so-called debt trap diplomacy, that it lends money. The classic example is it lent money for a port in Sri Lanka. No one needed that port in Sri Lanka. And the Sri Lankan government said, okay, China, you can have the port. We'll default on our segment of it. You can keep the port. And people are worried, China has now acquired a port in Sri Lanka. Well, really what China acquired was a useless piece of real estate that has essentially no value. And people say, well, China can put their warships there. True, but China would need a basing agreement with Sri Lanka. And frankly, China could get that basing agreement whether or not it owned the port. Owning the port is irrelevant from the standpoint of getting a basing agreement. So we've seen these Belt and Road projects on go slow really for the last 3 or 4 years. And well, I'll take a break now if you want to ask anything else about Belt and Road, because then I can get into China's military spending.
Well, let's just touch a little bit further on Belt and Road, because, of course, even Victoria here in Australia, right, has been having a conversation and is very actively discussing Belt and Road. So is this another example of just, a little bit of chat and nothing more?
Well, China will make big promises in order to get countries, or in this case, states, to sign an agreement that adopts Chinese language, that talks about win-win cooperation and mutual respect for both sides. And they get the agreement, and the promise is that China will provide below-market financing. Now, ultimately, all that is, forgive my using the word, is a bribe. It's not a bribe of any particular official. I'm not accusing anybody of breaking Australian law. But in effect, they're telling jurisdictions, whether it's Victoria or other countries like Myanmar or Pakistan, we'll give you a subsidy, below market financing, in exchange for geopolitical diplomatic recognition. Whether that actually comes to pass, whether Victoria gets the below market financing, will depend a lot on China's financial situation in 2021. And remember, all those stats I quoted so far, that's all BC. That's all before coronavirus. I think the chances that China will step up to subsidize extraordinarily rich Melburnians, extraordinarily rich by China standards, just to get a nice endorsement in the local press. I think Victoria's got another thing coming.
Okay, fair enough. Now, obviously, we've then talked about the economics, but there's also the military, and that's clearly on many people's minds, isn't it?
Right. Well, if you follow China's announcements, you would be very worried indeed. China has announced that it is going to construct over the 2030s 5 aircraft carrier task forces, 5 aircraft carrier battle groups, fully equipped in the U.S. style with an aircraft carrier surrounded by a picket of submarines with frigates close in to provide anti-aircraft support. And that sounds very scary. I mean, China is going to be able to project power greater than the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, which right now has 2 aircraft carriers in the South China Sea. And by U.S. standards, that's a massive show of force to have 2 aircraft carrier battle groups and operating in the same region at the same time. So if China really did have 5 aircraft carrier battle groups, which would mean 3 operational at any time in the Pacific, in the Western Pacific, that would indeed be scary for its neighbors. The reality is much less scary. China has 2 aircraft carriers. One is essentially a training carrier. It's called the Liaoning. It was formerly called the Riga, because it is a former Soviet carrier. It was bought by China from Ukraine in a bizarre deal where a Chinese casino magnate in Macau bought it to be a floating hotel and had it towed to Macau, but instead, of course, it in reality went to the Chinese military. The big win they got wasn't so much the carrier itself as all of the technical manuals of how to build all the systems, because, of course, an aircraft carrier is the single most complicated piece of equipment in the entire world. They got the carrier. They've been sailing it up and down through the Taiwan Strait. Essentially, they sail it from the East China Sea to the South China Sea and back again. They're trying to learn how to do carrier aviation. Now, this is a small carrier. It's a ski jump carrier. It's a little bigger than ships like the HMAS Adelaide, which I see from my window here in Darlinghurst sometimes. Now, the Adelaide is built as a helicopter carrier. It theoretically actually was built on a French design that will allow planes to take off, but it's not equipped with fixed-wing aircraft. The Chinese carrier is built for fixed-wing aircraft, and like I said, it's a little bigger than the Adelaide here in Australia, but nowhere near the size of a U.S. supercarrier. Also, it can only take planes taking off in one direction. So a U.S. carrier has 2 airstrips, so that it can take off and land planes at the same time. The Chinese carrier has a ski jump takeoff, and they're working on a vertical landing. So it would land like a Harrier jump jet, land straight down. I don't know how well it's working. They're still testing it. They then started their own indigenous carrier program. Their second carrier is now, I believe, just about to be commissioned. It, again, has been running up and down from the East China Sea to South China Sea and back again. It's, as far as I know, not fully equipped with airplanes yet. That's an indigenous, what they call Type 2 carrier in China. Again, it's a ski jump carrier. Essentially, it's the Liaoning, but slightly bigger, slightly more sophisticated. Certainly not anything up to U.S. technological levels. Carriers 3, 4, and 5, well, they're supposed to be in production. Carrier number 3 was recently spotted, it disappeared. So it was under construction and it disappeared from its dry dock. I think it may now have been located. People believe they've located it somewhere else, but its construction is certainly going much more slowly than had originally been planned. Also, China, although it's announced that it's going to move from U.S.-style cable, steam-powered cable supports for takeoff, catapults for takeoff, is going to move to super amazing, electromagnetic catapults that they've tested on land, but they don't have them working in any aircraft carrier. There's a test site available, on land, which doesn't really help you. U.S. carriers are beginning to get the F-35, so they're starting to get the 5th generation stealth fighters. Chinese carriers not only don't have stealth fighters, again, they're announcing they're going to develop a variant of the J-20 stealth fighter for carriers, but it doesn't exist yet. And in fact, China has only been able to produce 30 of its J-20 stealth fighters, which are based on a Russian engine. So they have to license the jet from Russia in order to equip their own airplane. So we all kind of think of China as being a technological powerhouse, but in fact, it's replicating the Russian model of being able to produce one prototype that sounds scary, that they announce in the press, that is really advanced, and in truth may be really advanced, but they can't industrialize it. They can't produce them at scale. They just don't have the resources. I mean, the United States has now deployed, I think, more than 200 F-35 fighters, and it's just on a production line. I mean, F-35s come out the production line every year, and of course, Australia is starting to acquire them as well. Australia will very soon have more 5th generation fighter jets than China, which, if you think about it, is just, makes China a little bit less scary. Now, there are all sorts of other military and military-related programs that China is engaging in that they just haven't been able to develop. So one thing that sounds particularly scary, quantum computing and quantum satellites. Will China be able to crack all of the computer code, all of the transmissions of the Five Eyes partners, the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, Canada? Well, in theory, quantum computing could do that. China's quantum satellite and its quantum computers are right now able to transmit data at a rate of 10K. That's right. 10K.
Really fast then.
Now, quantum computing, in theory, has the potential for super fast speeds and super fast computing. Maybe that'll happen. My guess is that if it does happen, then players like Google and Amazon will very quickly jump on it. But right now, China has made a propaganda victory by having the world's most advanced quantum computer. Again, it sounds impressive, but having one computer that is a prototype is nowhere near the same as being able to industrialize these things. Now, critics will say, but look at high-speed rail. China industrialized that. It built rail rolling stock on an incredible scale. And that's true, but rail rolling stock is really a whole different level of technological sophistication from a 5th generation stealth fighter.
So what you're really talking about here is the difference between symbolism and reality, right? So there's clearly a propaganda thing going on, and they're telling a particular story. But if you peer below the surface, then in reality, what you actually see is something very different.
Well, I think what we have is Soviet Union 2.0.
Right.
Back in the 1950s and 1960s, the Soviet Union really was a very scary opponent because it could produce lots of tanks. It could produce lots of aircraft, and that could potentially overwhelm NATO and Europe. And that was a real serious threat. But as the Cold War wore on, and as fighting and military technology became much more technological and much more sophisticated, it simply wasn't able to keep up. I mean, the first example of that was the space program. Soviet Union was first into space. They were first into space with a satellite, Sputnik. They were first into space with a human, Yuri Gagarin. They made all the initial milestones. But that was pretty cheap technology. When it came to something incredibly expensive, like going to the moon, they didn't even try because they simply couldn't afford it. And I think in the same way, what we're seeing in China is the Soviet Union's experience being replicated of a totalitarian regime that can mobilize enormous resources to do simple things at scale. But they don't have the economic resources or the economic wherewithal to do very sophisticated things at scale. And I think this is something that if we take off our China fear hats and put on our own economic thinking caps, it's something we would immediately recognize. I mean, if I asked you, Martin, you're an economist. If I were to, well, at least you act like one on TV. If I were to ask you, what it would be the best way for Australia to become a high technology powerhouse, would you say, oh, the government should start some programs, pick some state-owned companies, recreate Telstra in its old form, and throw money at it in an effort to reach the high technology sweepstakes? I mean, I won't even wait for an answer. Obviously, no, you wouldn't do that, because that's just not the way you can compete in the world of high technology. Now, government, even in Australia, can do repetitive low-tech things over and over again very well. And in fact, what we used to call utilities used to be economic activities that had become so commonplace, we felt we didn't really need private sector innovation to do them anymore. They just became utilities, things that were essentially free and you could rely on government to do them. Well, China does those things very well. I don't think it has the capacity to compete in the high-tech world, and it doesn't have the money. I mean, China is a poor country with a GDP per capita. Well, if we believe the private sector and the statisticians of the National Bureau of Economic Research in the US, probably around $8,000 per year. China says around $10,000 per year. Still, that compares with, in US dollar terms, something like $55,000 a year in Australia, something like $60,000 a year in the United States. It just doesn't have the resources to compete on a global level, which is what it's been trying to do in its efforts to be the next United States, the next superpower.
Mm. Well, fascinating. Now, you've written on this very recently. We should point people to that, shouldn't we?
I have an article at Foreign Policy that has gotten a lot of attention. It came out Monday morning on Foreign Policy Online. I'm sure you'll give you the link to put in the description box.
Yeah, absolutely. No, we'll do that. And I think it's been a really interesting exploration of the difference between theory and reality, right? And it goes back to this point. Sometimes you get the story, but actually the story is a narrative and it's not necessarily based on factual truth. And when you drill down, you often find things are actually rather different. By the way, there's the same story you could say about Australia, but we won't go there now, right?
Well, an announcement is not a completion. I mean, if Australians think that a few years ago the National Broadband Network was announced and all the grand plans for the National Broadband Network, and you think that Australia is a rich, sophisticated country with, I mean, whatever you might want to criticize your own government, with a really good track record of delivering on major projects, good by global standards. Well, if Australia doesn't always deliver on a major project like that, imagine China with much lower levels of expertise, with much lower levels of governance, with high levels of corruption, with all the problems China has. Imagine China's challenge in delivering on projects like that. And then I think you get a sense of perspective that although China may announce lots of things that sound impressive or sound scary, depending on your point of view, that doesn't mean they're actually following through on those announcements.
Yeah, well, I appreciate your time today, Salvatore, and very interesting conversation. And I'll put the links and things below so people can follow and read more about it.
Great. Thanks, Martin.
Thanks for your time. Cheers.